Again, welcome to Grace Place. You can have a seat, and every time we sing that song, I'm reminded of something I know, but occasionally the pressures and stresses of life cause us to forget it, and that is He's never going to let us down. And so, whatever you're going through, just keep that in mind, and keep your focus there, and you'll see God working in a very, very special way. Again, we're glad you're in worship, and thank you for being here today. And from time to time, we have the opportunity to reconnect with long-term friends. And we have a great friend of the Grace Places and a great friend of Karen and I's, and that's Danny and Mary McCain. And I'd like to ask Mary to stand if she would. Give her a great big welcome if you would. And while you're doing that, Dr. Danny McCain, who is serving he and Mary have been serving in Nigeria 30 years, is going to come and give us an update on what they're doing there. Danny shared with me about, probably 35 years ago when I was pastoring in Montgomery, Alabama, this vision to start these ministries around the world. And he started a ministry that's called Global Scholars and have over 100 academics that are serving in universities around the world, taking the gospel to places it would never be taken otherwise. So give Dr. Danny McCain a great big Grace Place welcome. You do that?
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here with you at the Grace Place. It's always a privilege to come and spend a little time with you. I come back to the States quite often, and every chance we have, we pass through here and wave to you a little bit. Some have asked, I was not going to talk about this, but Nigeria's been in the news a lot lately. Jos, my city, has been in the news. Plateau State, where we live, has been in the news. We've had lots of violence in Nigeria over the years. It's different kinds of violence, and this is a different kind of violence than we've had before. What we're experiencing now is what we call the farmer-herder. It's tradition, even in America, when they settled the West, the farmers were always fighting the herders, the cattle people. And that's what's going on. And it's been going on for several years. In my state, within 25 miles of my house, 200 people have died in the last 2 weeks. And so it's a tragedy. It's compounded by the fact that the Fulanis are 98%, 99% Muslims, and the farmers traditionally are Christians. And so it takes upon itself a very distinct, it looks very religious, and in many ways it is, but it's an old-fashioned ethnic conflict. And there's fault on both sides. So it's not that everybody is one-sided. Unfortunately, it's a serious problem. One issue that you might pray about. The Fulanis in 1995, there are 14 million Fulanis across West Africa. In 1995, there were only about 500 Christians. In the last 20-plus years, there's amazing things happening among the Fulanis. Hundreds, thousands are coming to Christ. And they're coming to Christ in strange ways. But the devil's not happy. So he's stirring up all this trouble to create tension between Christians and Muslims. And so you pray that the devil will be defeated and God will be honored and glorified in that. As Pastor Rick said, we've been part of this church since before the organization officially existed. This church gave the first offering to our organization. This church gave the first major contribution from one of the members. This church is the only church to have sent people to visit us in Nigeria, and you've done so 3 times. Elmira is cooking up another opportunity to come and visit, but wait 2-3 weeks till this thing settles down, and then you can come. So what my job has primarily been is I serve as an academic in a public university. This is a federal university. Academics do 3 things. We teach. I teach Bible and theology in a public university. Number 2, we do research. That's something we don't often talk about, but I've been involved in serious research. We've got major grants. We got a $500,000 grant to study Pentecostalism in Nigeria some years ago. That's a lot of money. And we had many people. We had, 30, 40 researchers involved. I've been recently researching the perception of leprosy. I just finished that among Christians in Nigeria, and just got another grant to study the same thing among Muslims. So we involved in research. And thirdly, we do service. These are the things we're evaluated when we go for promotion. You serve in the university, you serve on committees, you serve on admission committees, and all those kinds of things. I'm a member of the Senate. Because I'm a full professor, I'm a member of the Senate, which is the highest body in the university, and we have various Senate subcommittees. I mentioned last night one of the committees I served on. We grew out of an experience. The university received a letter from one of its former graduates a few years ago, and the student confessed that he cheated on his exams, and he returned his credentials and said, "I don't deserve these." So the administration didn't know what to do with it, so they sent it to the Senate, and the Senate didn't know what to do, so they appointed a committee. I was the chairman of the committee to determine what to do with this young man. Well, that brought out many more. Over the next 2-3 years, we had several letters and several people coming forward to confess. So eventually, the university committed a committee on restitution, confession, and forgiveness. And guess who's the chairman of the committee? Off campus, I've done a lot of work. We have religious education in public schools. We teach Bible in the public schools. We have done dozens and dozens of workshops to help those people and develop big fat teachers manuals based upon the curriculum. We have been involved in HIV work. We developed a faith-based AIDS approach for the public schools. And about 6 years ago, the National Teachers Institute came to us. They're the only people that do government. And they said, "We want you to do this for us, develop a plan." So the only in-service training Nigeria has is a faith-based AIDS program that we developed, and they pay us money to train people in every county in Nigeria. And we recently got about a $400,000 grant. And there was 2 $500,000 grants and one $80,000 grant to do this kind of work. So it's amazing when you can go and the government will pay for your ministry. And that's what we have done largely with that kind of work. We work with handicapped people. You know, polio has been a big problem in Nigeria, so we've developed these 3-wheel tricycles. We've given out 16,000 of those in the last 15 years. And God has blessed that ministry. I've been involved, we've had plenty conflict, so I've been involved in a lot of peace work, bringing Muslims and Christians together. We have been involved in preaching. I preached 72 times last year, and I've been involved in writing a lot. I've written 18 books and some other teaching material. So those are some of the kinds of ministries we've traditionally been doing. I see my ministry changing a little bit. I am now only teaching one undergraduate course. Most of my work is at master's and PhD level. And those students are serious students. Nearly all of those are church leaders, they're pastors, they're seminary teachers. And so we're moving in that direction. Even the appointments they give us in university are interesting. We had a big fire in our university about 2 years ago. It was my building, the biggest building on campus. I fought fire for 5 hours with my son, and then later the university appointed a for the investigation of the immediate and remote causes of the fire. And I was appointed on that committee. In fact, I was appointed chairman of that committee. We do not have forensic fire experts in Nigeria. We contacted 2 groups. They would charge us $30,000. So instead of doing that, they appointed me, and we were able to identify the exact cause of the fire. We could take you to the receptacle where it started, and we saved the university $30,000 and I learned a whole lot about fires. So, Dave, if your people need some consulting about fires, I'm available. They don't teach you how to do that in seminary, so you kind of make up the rules as you go along. Anyway, the Lord has been very good to us. Last time I was here, I talked to you about the Africa Study Bible. Remember that? How many were here and heard about the Africa Study Bible? How many were not here? Okay, a few of you. Can't tell you the story, but some 15 years ago, the Lord gave me an idea about taking the New Living Translation and revising it in Africa by Africans for Africans. We interacted with Kenneth Taylor and Tyndale House. That did not work, but they gave us approval to do a study Bible using the New Living Translation. It was an 8-year project, and it finished, I think, a little over a year ago, and it is now being distributed widely. The biggest surprise about this whole thing is how much Americans love this thing. Linda Deckard stopped me out in the lobby. I don't know if she's here with the children, but she told me this morning she got a copy of this Bible recently, and she is so excited about it. It's the most exciting Bible she's ever read. So if you, as an American, want to read an African Bible, the notes were all written in Africa, by Africa, for Africans. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere. Just type Africa Study Bible, and it'll show up. We're very proud of this project. There's 2 new things we're doing. Number 1, we're doing a youth version of this. And I won't tell you how we're doing it, but it's in the books, and it's already started. And the second thing we're doing is we're doing pastors' training workshops based upon this Bible. We provide the Bible at a subsidized rate. They can get it for probably less than half price if they will come and do a 1-day workshop. And then we have pastors for a whole day to teach them anything we want to teach them. And there are plenty of things that we can teach out of the Africa Study Bible. So you can pray about that. For $14 subsidy for everyone. We've done 2 of these. I'm doing one next month, and we have a lot of these coming up. Just a couple of closing observations. I have made a discovery recently that is very profound. It takes 30 years to get 30 years of experience. I mean, that's a fairly profound statement. But I've also discovered that 30 years of experience is worth a whole lot more than 5 years of experience. And so the Lord has given us these opportunities to develop contacts and to be in a public university, which is highly respected, to be in a position of respect and honor. It just opens absolutely incredible doors. Recently, our president, Stan Wallace, did some research, and I would love to share all of it with you, but he basically he found some research done at the University of Virginia about how societies change. And the average person thinks that societies change sort of one person at a time. You start at the grassroots level, and it just gradually, if you get a big enough mass, eventually it changes society. That's the way most of us think. But these researchers said, no, that's not the way it works. Research shows that change starts from the top down. And they gave 2 illustrations. One is the Jewish community. The Jewish community represents 3% of the people in America. And yet, the legal system is dominated by Jewish community. The medical people, the great medicine, education, all of these things. And what is the difference? They value education. They send their people to get the best education at the best institutions, and when their graduates come out, they get the best jobs, and they have the most influence in the society. The second example they gave is the LGBT community, who also represent about 3% of the people in this country. 30 years ago, everybody hated them, but they have done using the same methods in education, primarily in universities and in media. The majority of Americans have changed their attitudes based upon 3% of the people. That's largely the vision God has given to global scholars. We are not necessarily, I don't mean to sound improper, it's not necessarily a grassroots movement. We're not planting churches. There are wonderful organizations that are planting churches, but we are trying to influence the minds of the future leaders. We're in the public universities. We're in the top 2 universities in Africa right now, the number 1 university and the number 10 university. And we are there to influence. By the way, it's not my university. We're not in the top 10. It's the University of South Africa and Makerere University in East Africa. But we are trying to be there to influence those people, to influence the thinkers. The thinkers are already on the campuses. That's the vision that God has given us. And we thank you for your partnership over the years and your support. And this ministry, we don't report baptism, number of baptisms and number of churches planted. God has called other ministries to do that. We love them and support them. But God has called us to influence society, to change society, to change the thinking of people. And if you change the thinking of people, you change society. If you change society, you change the eternal destiny of people. Thank you very much for your love and support over these years.
Thank you so much, Danny. You know, I've said many times that God has used Danny McCain to have incredible impact and influence on an entire nation, and that's now spreading really throughout much of Africa, and we're blessed to have an opportunity to be a part of what God is doing there, and we're just thankful that God is at work in special ways all around the world, doing amazing things. So again, welcome to the Grace Place. I started a sermon series a few weeks ago that we've entitled TripAdvisor and Israel. And as I shared with you, we have made 9 trips to Israel, Karen and I have, 8 of those leading different groups. And what we're doing over these 9 weeks that we're looking at really various sites and places taking you through a trip through Israel is highlighting the places where I do our study times every day. And so we've already been in the Galilean region, and we went to the Mount of Beatitudes when we started, and from there to the Sea of Galilee, and from there to Chorazin, and from there to the feeding of the 5,000. And this weekend we're shifting our focus, and when we're there, we geographically move from the northern part of Israel, where the Galilean region is, into more of the central part of Israel, where Jerusalem is. And while we're there, we always make a trip to the Dead Sea and go through the wilderness to get there and the desert to get there. And the Dead Sea is about 1,500 feet below sea level. And we were there in September on our last trip. And the only way I could describe it was hotter than you can imagine. And it's always warm that far down, but it was flat out hot is what it really was. And but Jesus, after he was baptized by John the Baptist, spent 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, fasting and praying. And so we always stop at a site that overlooks the valley of the shadow of death. And I wanted to show you a few pictures of that. There we are climbing a little hill up to where the area is that overlooks the valley of the shadow of death. And you can see some Bedouins are there. And there's a picture of the group we just took over this past year, and or some of the group. Anyway, let's go to the next picture. That's me doing a little teaching. You can get some idea of how desolate it is. Behind me, and there's another picture that shows you even more clearly how desolate it is in that area. And Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights there. And after he was through, he had this incredible temptation from Satan. Now, as I'm wrapping up the teaching time, we have a little video I want to show you, because we ended up having a donkey that joined in the conversation. So.
It's William saying, hey.
I had just finished our teaching time, and that crazy donkey started braying like crazy. I was going to pray with the group, but after he got through doing his thing, that was totally unnecessary. And so I wanted to share with you from Matthew chapter 4 the account of the temptation of Jesus. So if you will turn there in your Bibles, if you didn't bring one with you, we have a Bible located in the back of a chair pretty close to where you're sitting. Please go ahead and take it out. And this is what it says beginning at verse 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you're the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you'll bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended to him. I want to take a few minutes and just talk to us about really triumphing over temptation in our lives. In fact, the Apostle Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. He says, "Every temptation that comes your way is the kind that normally," and I would just encourage you to circle the word normally, "comes to people." And so what he's saying is that temptation is normal. It happens to everyone. We're all in the same temptation boats, what it boils down to being. And this is what he says: "But God keeps his promises and will not allow you to be tempted beyond your power to resist. And at the time you're tempted, he'll give you the strength to endure it and provide you with a way out." And it's very important then to understand that Jesus gives us an example in Matthew 4. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 10, how that God makes it very clear that temptation is something that he can give us triumph or victory over. And I don't know where you're at when it comes to the various temptations of life. It may be that you're dealing with problems in your finances, and so you're tempted to cut a corner somewhere, or take advantage of someone, or do something that would be dishonest. You may be dealing with issues related to sex and related to your moral character that you're dealing with temptations in. It may be that you're dealing with areas of temptation when it comes to attitudes of bitterness and retaliation and revenge. Wherever it's at and whatever it's about, the issue's not where you're being tempted. The reality is all of us are being tempted in some area of our lives. And the key thing for us to keep in mind is whether it is a relational temptation, whether it's a moral temptation, whether it's an attitude temptation, whatever it is, that God wants us to triumph over that. Jesus gives us an example of that. Paul declares it to be so. And so let me encourage us today to keep in mind that whenever we face those things that we're talking about, and temptation is dogging our steps, realize that God makes it abundantly clear that he wants to work in a powerful way during our lives during that time. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that he will give you the power to resist in 1 Corinthians 10:13. And that means that God's power is available to help us to resist and to overcome through the strength that God gives us. Well, let me take us to Matthew chapter 4 for a few minutes, and we're going to take a look at the temptation of Jesus, and then I've got some things that I want to talk to us about overcoming temptation in our lives. Let me just start by identifying three basic facts about temptation. First of all, the temptation of Jesus immediately follows his baptism in Mark's account of this, in Mark chapter 1, verse 12, the Spirit immediately drove him into the wilderness. This is right after he is baptized. And one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind is this, that temptations occur most frequently when our guard is down because we're going through a time of success, a time of achievement, a time of accomplishment, a very good place in our life. When that happens, I don't know what happens to you, but it's easy for me to lose my prayer focus. It is easy for me to lose, by depending on God like I would at times of struggle and difficulty. And Satan knows that our guard is down. He knows our defenses are down. And what does he do? In the context of the best of times, he comes with these temptations. And in Jesus' case, he's just had this amazing thing happen. He's been baptized by John the Baptist. And if you remember that then this voice comes from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I am" what? Well pleased. And immediately Satan drives him out into the wilderness. And he's there and he's going through this time of fasting. After he's through fasting for 40 days. And I've only fasted for like 3 days. Never done a 40-day fast. Don't really have any interest in doing one, by the way. But after 3 days, I can tell you, a steak and baked potato is sounding really, really good, okay? And so here Jesus is, 40 days of fasting and prayer. He is in the wilderness. Let me tell you something. Not only the wilderness, he is in the desert. And I mean, I have been to the deserts out west, and they look like a garden by comparison, okay? And the bottom line is that he is in that situation for a protracted period of time. It is scorching hot where he's at, and he goes through this period of intense spiritual focus and faces this incredible temptation. Remember that Elijah the prophet challenges the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel to this showdown. And so they build these two altars, and they put a sacrifice on their altar, and he puts a sacrifice on his. They then began praying to their god Baal that he would send fire and consume their sacrifice. They pray for hours and nothing happens, and then Elijah starts taunting them, says maybe he's on a trip, or maybe he's asleep. Maybe you need to pray louder, okay? So they start cutting themselves and doing all kinds of weird things, and nothing happens. Elijah prays this little old tiny prayer, and the fire of God comes down, consumes the sacrifice, and a whole bunch of other stuff I'm not going to go to the details of. And then after all that's happened, and he then slays 400 prophets of Baal. I'd call that a big victory, wouldn't you? I'd call that on Mount Carmel a mountaintop experience is what I would call it. And you know what happens? Jezebel says, "Hey, Elijah, I'm going to do to you what you did to those 400 prophets of Baal." Now, God just given them this big victory. But I will tell you, Jezebel was a doozy. There's no getting around it. And so, she scared the daylights out of our friend Elijah. He hightails it to God knows where, and only God knew where he was at. So he hightails it there, running for his very life. See, here's the thing we've got to keep in mind. And that is that when we're going through the best of times, we should never let our defenses and our guard down, because it is guaranteed that Satan is going to come and attack us at that point and at that very place in our lives. And then, when you look at the temptation of Jesus, you see that temptation begins with your inner thoughts and desires. Now, Satan may have physically taken him to the pinnacle of the temple. He may have physically taken him to a mountain where he could see all the kingdoms of the world. I haven't quite found that mountain yet. So I think that these temptations occurred more in the mind of Jesus than they would have, him being physically taken. He may have been physically taken, I don't know. But the reality is that temptation always starts here. Before it ever moves to my hands or my feet or my behaviors or my action, it always starts in the mind. That's why God makes it really clear that we need to allow Him to guard our minds, that we focus on thinking about things that are right, thinking about things that are pure, thinking about things that are honorable, understanding that this is where Satan attacks us. Every temptation that you have in your life always starts here. And that's key for us to never forget. And so Satan comes attacking Jesus exactly like he attacks us. And that is bringing it to our mind and to our focus by doing that. And then Jesus' victory over this temptation does not mean that Satan never tempted him again. You remember that whenever the disciples and Jesus were at Caesarea Philippi, that while they were there, Jesus has this conversation with them and says, "Who do people say I am?" And they go through this little litany, and finally Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus talks about dying, and Peter says, you don't need to come here and die. I mean, their whole idea of the Messiah was he's going to drive the Romans out, reestablish the kingdom of David, and some amazing things were going to happen. And you remember what Jesus said to Peter? "Get behind me," who? Satan. That's what he says. "Get behind me, Satan." That's what he communicates to him. And that's important for us to never forget, because Satan didn't give up just because Jesus conquered the temptation in the wilderness. And he doesn't give up on Rick Addison, and he doesn't give up on you because you have been able to triumph over a temptation. He is always trying to find an inroad into our lives because he wants to destroy our lives. He wants to destroy our reputation. He wants to destroy our influence. He wants to destroy our effectiveness. And over again, you see him do that. And he's unrelenting in his temptations and unrelenting in his attacks. And so never forget that, that just one victory over Satan's temptation does not in any way mean that Satan will not come back and try to tempt you again. And so let me take a few minutes and just focus on the specifics of the attack of Satan. There was the temptation to turn the stones into bread, verses 3 through 4. The temptation of the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Now remember, we've already been told that Jesus was hungry. Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." And I would say that this was a temptation to use his power selfishly and for his own benefit. And frequently the temptations that you and I deal with have at its very core a selfish motivation. Whether it's a financial temptation, a sexual temptation, or whether it's a retaliation temptation or a revenge temptation, whatever it is, at its core is a focus on myself. My pleasures, my needs, my wants. You've hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. But where's the focus always at? It is on ourselves. And Satan knows that that is the way we are vulnerable, because he comes to us trying to tempt us in areas of selfish motivation in our life. And see, this temptation focused on how Jesus would then persuade other people to follow him. If everywhere he went, he was turning rocks into bread, let me tell you what, there'd be a crowd that would make a welfare line look like it was tiny. Because I promise you, there would be people coming by the droves to get the what? Free bread. And that was then not what Jesus came to do. In fact, he says that he came to die for us. And so it's important that we keep in mind that Satan comes trying to tempt him to use tactics to attract people that would have served only his own personal needs. And then Jesus answers this temptation by reminding Satan that true satisfaction is found when we are completely depending on God. And then there's a temptation to jump from the pinnacle of the temple. Verses 5 through 7, the devil took him to the holy city, had him stand on the highest point of the temple, If you're the Son of God, he says, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they'll lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. This was a temptation to do the spectacular and amaze people into following him. And I can't tell you many times I've had people communicate to me, you know what, Rick, what we really need is we need more sensational things happening. And the bottom line is that has never been the tactic that Jesus has. Now, I'm not telling you it's not the tactic that some people use in their ministries, and a lot of people that are in television ministries use, and I'll say that'd be unkind. That's just the reality of it. But one sensational moment must be superseded by a more sensational moment, or the crowds don't keep coming. And that's why Jesus said that's not what he came to do, and not do it that way. And I would just say that, I also have good theological reasons based on this for not jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. I mean, he's jump off the pinnacle of the temple. God's angels will protect you. And Jesus says, don't tempt the Lord your God. So if you want to go skydiving, help yourself. But remember that when you jump out of the plane, you're on your own with you and the parachute. Now, God will come back into the picture when your feet are on terra firma. But he should give you enough sense not to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. So I just want to encourage you, don't allow yourself to be focused on the sensational and the spectacular rather than understanding the principles that God gives us in his word. A gospel that's founded on the sensational is foredoomed to failure because it must continue producing things that are even more sensational. And then Jesus responds to this temptation by reminding Satan that God's rescuing power is not something to be played with. It can be trusted every day. I face dangers, you face dangers that, we know about sometimes, and other times we're totally unaware of. We have no idea that this delay over here prevented this catastrophic accident from occurring over here. We have no way of knowing that. But the bottom line is that God in his protective care is doing all kinds of things. And as much as a stoplight will frustrate the daylights out of Rick Addison, there are times it's probably spared me from being killed. And so the reality for all of us is this, that God does promise to protect us. He does promise that his angels are there. But the reality for us is that we don't put ourselves in situations of jeopardy unnecessarily. And that's what Jesus is certainly telling Satan. And then there was a temptation to fall down and serve Satan and give Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. Verses 8 through 10, they took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you'll bow down and worship me. Jesus said, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. In essence, Satan is saying, compromise why you came, come to terms with me, and all these things will happen. Well, keep in mind that Satan then worked through a lot of people and their misunderstanding of what the Messiah was going to do to continue to tempt Jesus in that area. You recall that, over and over again, the disciples would in essence say, and they said it different ways, but in essence say, now he's going to set up his kingdom. Now what were they talking about? They weren't talking about ruling and reigning in their hearts. They were talking about Israel becoming the dominant world power, driving the Romans out of Palestine, and them having positions of influence in his kingdom. And so they were constantly trying to persuade Jesus to go that direction, not understanding that Jesus came not to set up an earthly kingdom, but to set up a kingdom of ruling and reigning in my heart and in yours. So with all that in mind, let me take just a few minutes and focus on some ways that God can help us to overcome temptation. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 13, Jesus is asked by the disciples to teach them to pray, and he gives us what I would call a pattern for prayer. And in that prayer we call the Lord's Prayer, one of the things he tells us that we should include in our prayers is this, that we would not be led into temptation, but delivered from the evil one. And so he is communicating to us that we need to be reinforcing our walk with God in such a way that we are, able to overcome the temptations that we deal with. Let me just remind us that we should never let Satan intimidate us. We should respect the power of Satan, but we should never let him intimidate us. And the number one strategy that Satan uses is try to intimidate. You ever been around intimidating people? Well, if they're good at it, they can really effectively manipulate everybody around them through their intimidation. And Satan certainly tries to intimidate us. And I'm always astounded at the number of Christians that focus on the power of Satan rather than focusing on the power of God. Go back to 1 Corinthians 13, or 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, where Jesus says that, or Paul says that Jesus will give us the power that is needed to overcome the temptation. So is Satan powerful? Of course he is. Is God more powerful than Satan? Yes, he is. And we've got to keep that in perspective. And some of us, I think, look at it like, there's no way I can resist this temptation. It's too powerful. Well, the reality is that with God's strength and his power, you can resist it and you can overcome. And then turn to God and ask for help. Psalm 50:15. Call to me when trouble comes, and I will save you, and you will praise me. So God says that he wants us, whenever we're going through a time of temptation, just to send up a spiritual SOS signal and say, God, please help me. God, please do in my life what needs to be done. And, there's all kinds of examples of biblical characters who did this, like King David and Daniel and Peter and Paul and a whole bunch of others. And, so when should you pray those SOS prayers? Well, when your kids are driving you nuts and you're tempted to commit a felony, might be a good start, Or when you're tempted to make a sarcastic response to your boss, or you're filing your tax returns, or you smell the aroma of hot cinnamon rolls in the mall. I mean, maybe a good old SOS prayer right there would be very helpful. See, God wants us to ask for help because he understands us better than anyone else. In fact, Hebrews 4, verses 15 and 16 says, Jesus had the same temptations we do, though he never once gave in to them and sinned. So let us come boldly to God and find grace to help in our time of need. And so, to overcome temptation, don't let Satan intimidate you. Turn to God and ask for help, and focus your attention on the right things. James 1, 14 and 15, temptation is the pull of your own evil thoughts and wishes. These evil thoughts lead to evil action. Remember I said a few minutes ago that Satan's temptation was coming into the mind of Christ and tempting him in all these ways. And that's exactly what, we must understand. The battle for temptation is won and lost primarily in the mind. The minute it goes from considering it, and responding to it is the minute that we get ourselves into trouble. And so the key to overcoming temptation is to refocus our mind. Heard years ago, I read this letter to Dear Abby. It's when the Dear Abby was still there, and whoever the clone is today, I'm not sure. Some young pastor had written in about some temptation he was having. And so a pastor responded to that pastor in his temptation. He says, since I'm a pastor with 43 years of experience, I'd like to offer this suggestion to the inexperienced young minister who didn't know how to handle a very bold woman in his congregation who had designs on him. And this is what the pastor with 43 years of experience said. Whenever I noticed a romantic twinkle in the eye of a woman in my congregation, always check to make sure it wasn't caused by a reflection from the gleam in my own eye. No, that's pretty profound. Because sometimes the problem is in our own mind and our own heart and our own desires. You know, sometimes refocusing our attention means that we, leave the situation. In fact, Paul tells the young pastor Timothy, flee youthful lust. Someone put it this way, few speed records are broken when people are running from temptation. And that's true. And someone else says, if you don't want to get stung, then run away from the bees. And far too many times, we are allowing that to be something that, we focus our mind on as Satan tempts us. And then ultimately, it leads to actions that are so destructive in our life. And then be honest and accountable to a trusted friend. Ecclesiastes 4:9 and 10. 2 is better than 1 because if one falls down, the other can help him up. But if someone is alone and falls, there's no one to help him up. All of us need at least one person in our life that we can trust to be able to share what's going on in an area of temptation and know that that person will not only hear us, but give us good counsel and good advice and good support. Now, I put trusted friend. Don't go talk to just anybody about it. Are you aware there are people that are actual gossips? Are you aware of that? I mean, I can promise you, I know people in my world, I didn't say in here, in my world, okay, that if I want a lot of people to know something, I don't need to go to the news media. All I have to do is make sure they know. Because if they know, everybody they know will what? Know. Is that correct? So I said a trusted friend, which means somebody who can keep their big mouth shut. And if there's not things that somebody has entrusted you with that will die with you and never be shared, you are not a trustworthy friend. There must be things that will go to the grave that other people have shared with you that will never be shared with another person. And doing what I do, there are literally thousands of things that when I die will be buried with me when I am buried. Because they've never been shared with my wife. They've never been shared with anyone else. Why? Because they were shared in absolute total confidence. And let me tell you something. There must be people in your world like that. Without it, you are a sitting duck for Satan, and he's going to overcome you. And we must never forget that. And I just would remind us of what James 5:16 says. Admit your sins to one another and pray for each other that you may be healed. I've said many times that to experience forgiveness, you confess your sins to God. To experience healing, you confess your sins to a trusted friend. And when you do, you'll discover that God does a very special work of healing in your life. And then resist the tempter, James 4:17. Give in to God and resist the devil, and he will run away from you. And resisting the tempter requires giving in to God, surrendering your life to him and his control. Resisting the tempter requires just resisting the devil. Simply saying what Jesus said, get behind me who? Satan. Resist him. If you are going to entertain him, he's not going to leave you. You must resist him if you're going to experience God's incredible power to overcome temptation. Bow your heads with me. God, I come to you today very well. The Holy Spirit has spoken to many of us in this room about an area of significant temptation we're dealing with. And God, I don't know what those areas are, but you do. And you know exactly how you want to work in those situations. And so we just pray that we would apply what we've come to understand today from your word in a way that is something that you put into practice, help us to put into practice in our lives, that will enable us to resist the devil, that will enable us to triumph over temptation, that will enable us to experience your marvelous power at work in our lives. And then, Father, I pray for those who've come here who do not know you personally. that they would say, Jesus, thank you for dying as my substitute on the cross. I ask you to forgive me for all of my sins. I ask you to come into my life and to make me a brand new person. And I believe that you've forgiven me. I believe that through your grace and your mercy, that every sin I've ever committed has been forgiven and forgotten. And then I ask you to take up your place of living in my life. And I surrender the steering wheel, the gas pedal, and the brake pedal of my life to you. And I want to live every day, not in my strength, but in your strength. Not in my ability, but in your ability. And I know you offer me that. And I know through the power of your resurrection that you offer me the gift of a changed and a transformed life. And not only a changed and transformed life, but the gift of eternal and everlasting life. I accept the gift of forgiveness. I accept the gift of transformation. And I accept the gift of eternal and everlasting life. Thank you for saving me and making me a new person you today. And I ask this in your name.